thank you again, Wyatt and Barbara, all the staff, Megan, Adam, Nathaniel, Sam, Ananda. I'm going to forget people, so I won't go on. But I just wanted to say also that I felt, although all the things have been wonderful at this conference, the highlight has been the staff readings, I have to say. They have been incredible. So, yes, this year I'm giving a craft lecture. And I obviously thought various different topics. This talk comes out of, although it's quite different from, a talk I was asked to give at the V&A in London for Shakespeare's 400th death anniversary. Is that right? I'm going to get that wrong. On the Tempest. And I thought, I'm not really a Shakespeare person, except in so much as I'm a poet, and we're all Shakespeare people, but I'm not a Shakespeare scholar. And of course one loves The Tempest. It's full of poetry if there's no plot. None. It's not a play. But it was, again, I think this was in 2015. Is that right? I'm going to get that wrong. But it just was really striking to me reading The Tempest and rereading it in Athens and thinking about the route. Okay, maybe it's vaguely in the Caribbean, but it seems to be on the route from Tunis to Naples, it's basically Lampedusa, if you were to put a geographical. And that there are people shipwrecking there all of the time. As I was giving the speech, I think there were 500 people who had drowned in that passage. And I've been thinking about how to write about current events. I mean, this has been something, there's been a lot happening in Greece, and I don't think of myself necessarily as a political poet, but I felt more and more compelled to write about things that were happening. One of the things I think, my children are often swimming in the Aegean, and I think about they're swimming in the Aegean, and children just like them are drowning in the same body of water, every day. So I began thinking about that. And for the Tempest lecture, I went through various classical tropes of shipwreck, because that's what I do. But I became more and more interested also in the relationship between, which I think was also covered in Randall's lecture, fictional and non-fictional events. And just the more you look into the literature of shipwreck, the more you realize that it is the real events are constantly feeding into the metaphorical events, and vice versa. So all poets, and I think all writers, love the Beaufort wind scale, right? This is everybody's favorite poem. And it's a great thing to teach as a list poem, and how to talk about how to describe events. Probably the one that is the most poetic is actually on the flip side of the first page of your handout. And what fascinates me is it's the description on land and the description at sea at the same time. So there is built into the scale a kind of strange empathy where the people on shore think about what it's like at sea, and the people at sea think about what it's like on shore. So description on land, description at sea, calm or zero. Smoke rises vertically, sea like a mirror, and the sea, of course, is always mirroring and doubling. Light wind, wind felt on face, leaves rustle, ordinary veins moved by wind. Small wavelets, rippled, formed, but do not break, a glassy appearance maintained. Moderate, raises dust and loose paper, small branches begin to move. Small waves with breaking crests, frequent whitecaps. It goes on. There's a wonderful thing about umbrellas being difficult to manage, or there's a whistling in the wires. It's just all of these wonderful visual and oral observations, which I think is the essence of writing and description and poetry. Of course, it ends, hurricane very rarely experienced widespread damage. The air is filled with foam, sea completely white with driving spray. Various poets have used the idea of a scale like this. Probably the most successful and famous is Don Patterson's what is it called? Scale of Intensity, which was written during the Bosnian War. And, but it does end with like sea completely white and starts with sea calm like a mirror. But it does other really weird things, like there's a change in the weight of ordinary objects, reversed vortex in the draining bath. So I was very intrigued by this, and it turns out that Beaufort, in Greece we say Beaufort, who is credited with this and gives his name to the scale, did not write this scale. So I'm going to go into that. There's a whole book trying to figure out who wrote the scale, and I was really excited about it because I had been researching this for a long time, but it turns out there's no answer. It may have been written by committee. So some of the most ravishing descriptions of the sea being whipped up in a tempest are contained in the empirical scale of wind force as encountered on sea and land, the modern Beaufort Scale. It escalates from 0 to a hurricane force of 12 where the sea is completely white. While the Beaufort Scale is named for Sir Francis Beaufort, upon whose 1805 scale the modern one is based, his observations had a nautical briskness and reflected not the wind's effects on the sea or the land, but on the sails of a British Navy frigate, from calm and or just sufficient to give steerage way, to hurricane or that which no canvas can withstand. Poetic phrases, which incidentally tend to natural iambic pentameters. Because this was wind forced as experienced by a ship at sea, there was no reason to go higher than this, because above this force the ship would not survive. 13 is shipwreck. Beaufort's effort was part of a more general movement to make observations of the weather less subjective and more widely transferable as scientific measurement. In 1805, a pharmacist named Luke Howard delivered a lecture in London on the classification of clouds. Moving away from the whimsical, a cloud that's dragonish, he proposed a Latin taxonomy: cirrus, which is a ringlet of hair; cumulus, a heaped cloud; stratus, a strewn cloud, as well as hybrids thereof, vocabulary that still informs the contemporary International Cloud Atlas, another thing that poets love. It's unclear to me who changes Beaufort's sail-based descriptions. It might be a Sir George Simpson, who is not a poet, he's an engineer who updated the scale in 1926 for steamships and observers on shore, including the drift of smoke and the rustling of leaves. The original Beaufort scale has a literary connection. It actually goes back and back, but going back at least a century to Daniel Defoe's Scale of Winds of 1704. Defoe probably was also working from some sort of existing definition of wind force. In fact, that's in here. I just hadn't read this book when I read this, unfortunately. He witnessed the great storm of 1703, which was probably the most severe storm to hit England in recorded history, and wrote a book, The Storm, on the event, which included first-hand accounts from numerous witnesses. On land, the lead tiles of Westminster Abbey were blown off, and 2,000 massive chimney stacks in London toppled. Scores of ships were wrecked, including 40 merchant vessels and 13 Royal Navy ships, with some 1,500 seamen drowned at Goodwin Sands alone. Some ships were blown hundreds of miles out to sea, others inland to end up beached 20 miles from the water. The ferocity of the storm beggared description. Defoe wrote, "No pen could describe it, no tongue express it, nor thought conceive it, unless by one in the extremity of it." But Defoe had experienced it and collected and published the first-hand experiences of others. It's probably the first work of modern journalism in that way. He had been so shocked at the depth to which the mercury plummeted in the barometer, which is a relatively recent invention, at the outset, that he thought at first that his kids must have meddled with the instrument. He was moved, I like that detail, Daniel Defoe shouting at his kids, "Who's messing with the barometer?" He was moved to produce a numbered scale of the winds themselves, the 12-toned Scale of Winds, ranging from 0, a stark calm, to 11, Tempest, with intermediary steps such as a fresh gale, a 5, or a fret of wind, a 9. Yet he was keenly aware that one man's fresh breeze was another man's gale. Of course, he's most famous now for the 1719 novel Robinson Crusoe, based at least partly on the real castaway Alexander Selkirk, who makes a wonderful cameo in a Patrick Kavanagh sonnet. Look that one up. a privateer who survived alone on a desert island from 1704 to 1709. There are other, though, cases. There's a Surgeon Henry Pittman, whose accounts feed into that. One of the first novels in English, Robinson Crusoe is deeply informed by current events and eyewitness accounts. I'm very interested in the description, again, of the storms. So in the first chapter of Robinson Crusoe, I think it's the first chapter, Robinson Crusoe is a virgin sailor who encounters his first squall. So it's interesting the reaction of the experienced sailors with a landlubber. And it's very cinematic. So this is the sailors. How do you do after it? I warrant you were frighted, weren't you, last night when it blew but a capful of wind? A capful, do you call it, said I. 'Twas a terrible storm. A storm, you fool, you, replies he. Do you call that a storm? Why, it was nothing at all. Give us but a good ship and sea room. I love the idea of sea room. And we think nothing of such a squall of wind as that. But you're but a freshwater sailor, Bob. Come, let us make a bowl of punch and we'll forget all that. Do you see what charming weather 'tis now? Of course, this isn't the storm. And when it comes to the storm that will wreck the ship, Crusoe's one advantage is that he does not know the meaning of the word founder, which is, it's like the ship is going to founder. The storm was so violent that I saw what is not often seen, the master, the boatswain, and some others more sensible than the rest at their prayers and expecting every moment the ship would go to the bottom. Of course, Shipwreck is really where Western literature begins. The Odyssey begins with Odysseus already a castaway and the sole survivor of his whole armada. So, of course, this is a theme that is picked up again and again. The Aeneid, which is 19 BCE, with Aeneas, a refugee fleeing the devastation of Troy, in a tempest with his flotilla off the coast of Carthage. This does not end up being a shipwreck, but it's a very similar setup. The first words spoken by a mortal in Virgil's poem are Aeneas in terror of the storm. There's been some back and forth with the gods, but this is, we're now open to the plane of human beings. So these are the first words, as it were, of the poem. And in dread of a watery grave, lifting his palms to heaven, he exclaims, 3 times, 4 times luckier were those who died before their parents' eyes under Troy's high walls. This is another theme that gets picked up again and again with Shipwreck, that a watery grave is the worst thing that can happen to you. You're not buried, you're eaten by the fish. It's much better to die on dry land. A blast of wind from the north strikes the sail as he speaks. Waves shot to the stars. The oars shattered. The prow swung around, exposing the side to the waves. Also, writers just like to describe storms and shipwrecks. We just enjoy that. And then a mountain of water broke over the fleet. The crew of some ships bobbed high on the crest, while the waves' deep trough revealed to others the deep seafloor churning with sand. That is so visual and dramatic. Many are drowned, and one ship is wrecked, but Aeneas and his own ship make nearest land, the coast of Libya. There, Aeneas utters some of the poem's most famous words, Forsan et haeco lim meminisse juvabit. Someday, perhaps, it will help to remember these troubles as well. The counterintuitive association of a ship in distress at sea and pleasure on shore is not coincidence. The Roman poet Virgil is engaged in a conversation with, or rather a rebuttal of, one of his strongest influences, Lucretius, and his didactic Epicurean epic, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. Epicurean philosophy was based on a set of nautical metaphors. So to be at peace is ataraxia, which means to be on smooth waters, untroubled waters. I think we still have this sort of idea of troubled waters and smooth sailing. So this is a very Epicurean idea. When Lucretius wants to describe the philosophical man looking upon the troubles of others in Book 2, he describes a spectator on shore watching a ship in a tempest. How sweet it is to watch from dry land when the storm winds roil a mighty ocean's waters and see another's bitter toil. Not because you relish someone else's misery, rather it's sweet to know from what misfortunes you are free. So Aeneas is both the sailor in difficulties and later the philosophical observer on shore who can find pleasure in being out of harm's way. For us, the formulation of Lucretius might seem kind of callous, the sweetness of watching a shipwreck. But this was a standard entertainment in ancient times. I mean, again, this was the ultimate reality TV. In fact, Romans later even staged these things in the Colosseum and so forth. But traditionally, shipwreck to those on shore was an entertainment and enrichment, especially when cargo washes ashore. One man's wreck is another man's salvage. It is thrilling to watch. Think of the Titanic or A Perfect Storm. It keeps us on the edge of the seat. We know the outcome, or any number of genre paintings, the contemplation of which must have amused many bored occupants of genteel drawing rooms. Take Dickens' description of the excitement engendered by a potential shipwreck in the Tempest chapter of David Copperfield. "What is the matter?" I cried. "A wreck, close by." I sprung out of bed and asked, "What wreck?" "A schooner from Spain or Portugal, laden with fruit and wine. Make haste, sir, if you want to see her. It's thought down on the beach she'll go to pieces every moment." So there is that sort of thrill of watching when you're safe on shore, and of course other things are going to wash ashore too. This pleasure of the spectacle of shipwreck is not confined to realistic fiction. In The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen, 1836, the mermaid of the title witnesses the foundering of a ship during a storm, not from the vantage point of someone safe on shore, but from the point of view of a creature who is in her native element and cannot drown. A dreadful storm was approaching. Once more the sails were reefed, and the great ship pursued her flying course over the raging sea. The waves rose mountains high, and as if they would have overtopped the mast. But the ship dived like a swan between them, and then rose again on their lofty foaming crests. To the little mermaid this appeared pleasant sport. Not so to the sailors. The ability to project one's imagined self at sea from the shore, or from the shore to the sea, to leap into the future or the past, seems to be part and parcel of seafaring itself. One of the Iliad's most famous similes involves Hera zipping as swiftly as the thought of a traveler who wants to be elsewhere. So there's this idea of, a man who wants to sail can think of being elsewhere and then can be elsewhere. Just that thought puts you forward. In The Ancient Mariner, in Coleridge's ballad, when he describes setting out on his doomed voyage, it is simultaneously in terms of the high spirits of those on board. A happy beginning to any voyage in literature should be viewed as grim foreshadowing. And from the view of those watching the ship depart from the shore. Dropping below the horizon is not something the sailors themselves experience, but it is an illusion to spectators created by distance and the curvature of the earth. The ship was cheered, the harbor cleared, merrily did we drop below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. So again, there's that doubling of we are on the ship, but I am imagining this from the shore. Likewise, when the ship is becalmed, the mariner famously describes it as a painted ship upon a painted ocean, not only from the viewpoint of someone looking at the ship, but of someone viewing the ship as a figure in a seascape, not just from shore, but from being snug in a furnished room. Shipwreck for many writers, as with Petronius, whose quotation has this paper, is a metaphor for our mortality. Not so in Lucretius. Shipwreck ends lives, but for Lucretius, life begins with shipwreck. What is an infant but a shipwrecked sailor, naked and helpless, washed up on the shores of light, that is the shores of life? A human baby's like a sailor washed up on a beach by the battering of the surf, naked, lacking the power of speech, possessing no means of survival, when first nature pours him forth with birth pangs from his mother's womb upon light's shores. There's another shipwreck in, there's a couple shipwrecks in Lucretius. One of them, too, he describes the universe as shipwreck. All of these atoms bobbing around in the universe that can come together or drift apart are like the flotsam of a wrecked ship that are floating on waves. So he has and the word material comes out of this metaphor. Lucretius also goes on to describe a historical shipwreck in a passage on the futility of superstition. This time he puts us not in the mind of the philosopher snug on shore, but of a person tossed in a tempest and beseeching the gods not to let him die. As with foxholes, there are no atheists on a ship in a storm. So this is also something you see again and again in shipwreck literature, I imagine because literally true, of people praying on board when all hope is lost. Or when a tempest rises up, when winds of gale force sweep, blah, blah. Take the commander and his fleet out on the deep with all his mighty legions and his elephants of war. What? This commander could, aside from the war elephants, be Aeneas or Odysseus or even Jason. But the war elephants are sort of something of a giveaway. Any Roman reading this passage would have been immediately put in mind of their old foe, King Pyrrhus, who ended up setting out for Italy from Epirus in a flotilla of ships with a force of 20 elephants, 3,000 horse, 20,000 foot, 2,000 archers. Many vessels are lost in this particular passage of water, right off of modern Albania. We will see that again and again. Illyria, we're right off the coast of Illyria. Pyrrhus flings himself to the sea. This is where history parts ways with a poetic example, as Pyrrhus is a strong swimmer, and he makes sure 2 of the elephants also survive. The other thing about shipwreck is animals. So a huge number of literary shipwrecks have dogs in them that may or may not make sure. The relationship of journeys by sea with journeys of thought and time, and particularly the ability of shipwreck to jar the imagination into the future or the past, or the world under the sea. We have that in The Little Mermaid and her palace, but we also have that in the Iliad, describing the palace of Poseidon. Or another person's experience is manifest throughout the songs of the sea. Sirens sing, sailors sing, pirates sing, whales sing, sea witches sing at their loom, mermaids sing, and poets sing. So this is obviously a very important part of the sea. And of course, the most famous sea shanty of all, full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but to suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. So one of the interesting things, though, is how people write these ballads of the sea. I'm going to start talking about these sea ballads with one of my favorites, and I think a great poem in its own right. That is Gordon Lightfoot's brilliant and popular hit of 1976, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. If you are ever teaching ballad form, teach this, because it has everything in the genre in it. It's a nearly perfect example of the genre. With its efficient storytelling, its lyrical melancholy, Lake Superior is a bit of a sea witch herself. She sings in the room of her ice-water mansion. Its archaisms, a good ship and true, very important in a ballad. Its ring structure. Its elliptical storytelling via direct speech. It has the feel of a folk song, considering the devastatingly swift and uncluttered storytelling of these lines. When supper time came, the old cook came on deck, saying, "Fellas, it's too rough to feed ya." At 7 p.m., a main hatchway caved in. He said, "Fellas, it's been good to know ya." Lightfoot later changed that because people objected to the truth of the matter, but obviously that's the great version. As the song itself says, the wave turned the minutes to hours, but here hours are telescoped into minutes. Even the ship's name, the Edmund Fitzgerald, sounds like it comes straight out of a collection of ancient Scottish ballads, and it holds its own with an anonymous masterpiece such as the 15th century Sir Patrick Spens. But the song was written in 1976, hardly a year after the actual wreck, lost on November 10th, 1975, in Lake Superior with all of her 29 hands on board. The context of the song, though, and this is, I think, where it's a craft lecture, except that boats are craft, but that how do you deal with a current event? Well, one of the things is to cast it into a past. The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down of the big lake they call Gitchigumi. The lake, it is said, never gives up its dead when the skies of November turn gloomy. With the Native American name for Lake Superior, Gitchigumi, the big water, Lightfoot harkens back to Longfellow's 1855 saga, Hiawatha. But this isn't the Longfellow poem that he has in mind. The Longfellow poem he has in mind is almost certainly The Wreck of the Hesperus. The title is now better known than the poem, but it used to be one of these sort of old chestnuts that you were made to recite in school, like the Casabianca Bishop poem by Felicia Herman. I have no doubt that Lightfoot knew the poem well at the time of the writing of The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, Like Lightfoot's song, that poem is a pseudo-folk ballad, fluent in the genre's conventions, the lyric moment, the archaisms, the direct speech. Sometimes all of these combine together, as in this stanza, "Last night the moon had a golden ring, and tonight no moon we see. The skipper, he blew a whiff from his pipe, and a scornful laugh laughed he." Our ballad lore instincts, not to mention the title, tell us that the skipper will not come to a good end. The moon, the skipper, the daughter, the storm, all of these elements. By the way, it's another thing about shipwreck literature is it often involves a parent and a child. Very often a father and a daughter, which we will see when we come back around to Shakespeare. All of these elements are also to be found in the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, which begins, though there are many versions. The king sits in Dunfermline town, drinking the blood-red wine. "Oh, where shall I get a skeely skipper to sail this ship of mine?" And whose most famous lyrical moment also contemplates the moon. And again, there are versions of this. Coleridge has a different version as the epigraph to Dejection and Ode. "I saw the new moon late yestreen, with the old moon in her arm, and if we go to sea, master, I fear we'll come to harm." The ballad's direct speech, indeed its dialogue, is completely theatrical. Interestingly, the anonymous balladeer from the 15th century sees fit to compare the drowning noblemen who have accompanied Sir Patrick Spens on his doomed journey back from Norway with a play. "Oh, laith, laith were our good Scots lords to wet their cork-heeled shoon, but lang or other play was played, they wet their hats aboon." Again, note the efficiency and wit, which does not detract from the pathos of the storm rising. At first, they are loath to wet their shoes, but by the end, their hats are swimming in the tide. It is thought that Sir Patrick Spens may reflect an actual 13th century marine disaster connected with Margaret, the Maid of Norway. Certainly Longfellow's Wreck of the Hesperus, published in 1840, was influenced by the Great Blizzard of 1839. 3 gales in the space of 2 weeks in December of that year wrecked over 50 vessels off the coast of Maine, strewing the shore with debris and the drowned. The Hesperus was a real ship which was damaged in Boston Harbor, but the wreck that inspired the poem is probably the schooner The Favorite, which was dashed against Norman's Woe, a reef off of Gloucester Harbor. 17 hands were lost, and a woman, a Mrs. Sally Hilton, was washed ashore tied to the windlass bit. As in the poem, the skipper's daughter, a pious maiden, is washed ashore tied to the mast. In the immediate aftermath of the storm, Longfellow wrote in his journal that he should write a ballad on the wreck, but confused it or conflated it with the Hesperus. Both of these wrecks were described in one edition of the Boston Morning Post. And he began the poem only 2 weeks later. It came not in lines, but in stanzas, and it was published in early January of 1840. So again, very close to the time of the wreck, but by casting it in this ballad form, giving a bit of distance. Of course, there's also a wonderful moment in that Wreck of the Hesperus, which is almost that Beaufort observation. "The skipper, he stood beside the helm, his pipe was in his mouth, and he watched how the veering flaw did blow the smoke, now west, now south." So you see that smoke wavering, a wonderful image. A flaw, by the way, is a squall. I have to mention Gerard Manley Hopkins, but I'm actually going to do this very briefly. He has 2 poems on the subject of historical wrecks. The Wreck of the Eurydice, which, though in his sprung measure has the look and feel of a ballad, and his masterpiece, the 35-stanza ode, The Wreck of the Deutschland. In both cases, the name of the ship is already laden with metaphorical possibilities. The Wreck of the Deutschland describes a real event which has for him symbolic weight, with its drowning of 5 Franciscan nuns fleeing discriminatory anti-Catholic laws in Germany. The title could not be more fraught. But can it be coincidence that the poet's father, Manley Hopkins, was not only a pastor, but the founder of a marine insurance company, and the author of a book titled The Port of Refuge, or Advice and Instruction to the Master Mariner in Situations of Doubt, Difficulty, and Danger? The title sounds metaphorical, advice for the storm-tossed soul, but God only appears in the book in the phrase acts of God. Other books by the same author include a handbook of average and a manual of marine insurance. I won't do the aside necessarily on Pippi Longstocking, but her sort of pirate father is also based on a real person. Carl Emil Peterson, a Swedish sailor shipwrecked on Christmas Day in 1904 in Papua New Guinea. Nicknamed Strong Charlie by the islanders, he falls in love with the king's daughter. Princess Singdo marries her and becomes king himself in time. We'll see that a lot. But it does happen. One of the great poems, I think, that deals with a current event is, of course, Hardy's Convergence of the Twain, which was written about the sinking of the Titanic. There were billions of poems that were written about the sinking of Titanic. I mean, I think for months and months, newspapers just got these pathetic poems. But this happens to be a great poem, I would say. I say arguably great in the written version. I can say here, great poem. It was, again, written very rapidly after the event, which is something we think, well, maybe you need distance. But this was written pretty much a couple weeks after the event. It was published scarcely a month after in the May 14, 1912 program of the Dramatic and Operatic Matinee in aid of the Titanic Disaster Fund, given at Covent Garden, an event at which such celebrities as Sarah Bernhardt and Anna Pavlova performed. But this also does this partly by, it speaks not only in hardy-ish tones, consider thrid for thread, but harkens back as far as Spenser with the adjective stilly. The wreck itself seems not to have just settled on the seafloor, which is what would have actually happened, but to have been there for an age. Over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent, the sea worm crawls, grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent. The poet's mind leaps not only to some future point when the ship will be bleary with sea creatures, but leaps to the bottom of the sea, the rich and strange place where poets and writers from Homer to Shakespeare imagine sunken treasures and palaces under the sea. So it becomes one of these sea palaces. Jewels and joy designed to ravish the sensuous mind lie lightless, all their sparkles bleared and black and blind. Dim moon-eyed fishes near gaze at the gilded gear and query, what does this vaingloriousness down here? This poem twins the ship and the iceberg, which is a kind of doubling. The sea doubles things. But the form is also kind of amazing. The first two lines of each stanza are trimeters, arguably hemistichs, which collide in the stately hexameter that closes each tercet. So real wrecks are laden with the metaphorical cargo of fictional ones. One of the best descriptions of a shipwreck in literature is, of course, the second canto of Don Juin, Byron's Don Juin. He got in trouble for the details because they were taken, again, from actual shipwreck, and he was accused of plagiarism. So many of the details are salvaged from accounts of actual disasters, particularly from Dalyell's 1812 Shipwrecks and Disasters at Sea. Among them, again, if you think of this canto coming out in 1819, he's using a lot of the details from the wreck and raft of the Medusa, which was in 1816 and is the subject of Jericho's famous painting, as well as the earlier mutiny of the Bounty. He was accused of plagiarism, so he wrote to his editor, John Murray from Ravenna, in this letter. He said, "Enclosed are the two acts corrected. With regard to the charges about the shipwreck, I think I told both you and Mr. Hobhouse years ago that there was not a single circumstance of it not taken from fact. Not indeed from any single shipwreck, but all from actual facts of different wrecks." The poet considered himself to have an inheritance of storms. He described himself as having an inheritance of storms from his grandfather, John Byron, who was known as Foul Weather Jack. So called because he never embarked on a voyage without a tempest. You did not want to go to sea with this man. He later published a memoir of his experience of shipwreck, desertion, and exotic islands on the ship implausibly named the Wager and commanded by a Captain Cheap in 1768 as the narrative of the Honorable John Byron. The memoir of the Wager includes John Byron's having to eat his dog, a harrowing detail the grandson would take for his shipwreck canto of Don Juan. But Byron had also been in storms at sea himself and in very near to shipwreck. He describes in a letter to his mother being shipwrecked off of Corfu, the same general patch of water Pyrrhus encountered a tempest in, and not far from the Illyrian coast where Viola and Sebastian are shipwrecked in Twelfth Night. 2 days ago, I was nearly lost in a Turkish ship of war owing to the ignorance of the captain and crew, though the storm was not violent. See, he's an experienced sailor. Fletcher yelled after his wife. The Greeks called on all the saints, the Mussulmen on Allah. The captain burst into tears and ran below deck, telling us to call on God. That's not a good sign. The sails were split and the mainyard shivered, the wind blowing fresh. Again, we have these sort of terms. The night settling in, and all our chance was to make Corfu, which is in the possession of the French, or our other choice was, as Fletcher pathetically termed it, a watery grave. I did what I could to console Fletcher, but finding him incorrigible, wrapped myself up in my Albanian capote and immense cloak, and lay down on deck to wait the worst, adding, I have learnt to philosophize in my travels, and if I had not, complaint was useless. You really see in the letters that Byron's a mensch. So it's Stoic, but it's also Epicurean. He is looking back with pleasure on a storm at sea. He's casting his imagination into the past from the safety of dry land, and he's even making a wry anecdote out of it. So when the ship in Don Juin sinks, again, you have this wonderful asyndeton. This is piling up things without an and. At 8:30, and remember, it's always exact time. We got that also in the wreck of the Edmund and Fitzgerald. Again, all these scientific observations that happen at the point of wreck. At 8:30, booms, hen coops, spars, and all things for a chance had been cast loose that could keep afloat the struggling tars, for yet they strove, although of no great use. There was no light in heaven but a few stars. The boats put off or crowded with their crews. These are the lifeboats. She gave a heel and then a lurch to port, and going down head foremost, sunk, in short. But Don Juan, it turns out, can swim. He can swim probably as well as Byron says. I think he can swim as well as I can. And so he makes shore, and one of the things, if you're a shipwrecked sailor, what are you going to find on shore? You're going to find a princess. Now, this usually doesn't go well. It turns out, sorry to break the news. It turns out, she could actually be a witch and turn you into a pig. She could be all of these things. For her, it's not much better. You're probably going to jilt her, or you might be a pirate. But, there's always this. And it turns out it's partly about finding a beautiful person naked on the beach. This turns out to trigger other things. So this is, so Heidi is this princess. She's of course the daughter of a pirate who rules the island. And in fact, it's kind of interesting that she's actually only half Greek. She's half Moorish from Fez. And walking out upon the beach below the cliff towards sunset on that day, she found insensible, not dead, but nearly so, Don Juan, almost famished and half drowned. But being naked, she was shocked, yet deemed herself in common pity bound as far as in her lay to take him in, a stranger dying with so white a skin. So this erotic moment is important. And then it's a very sad moment. Actually, we think of Don Juan as a comedy, but it ends with her dying of a sort of stroke, and she's pregnant with child, and she's so innocent that she sort of they fall in love and they do the deed, but she just doesn't. They don't get married, and that's important because in the Tempest, the main thing that Prospero will try to avoid is exactly this situation. You do not want a sailor coming to shore and marrying your daughter if you don't know his background. You don't want him to show up naked. It's very important in the Tempest. Everyone's clothes are dry. And you want to make sure they get married before they get busy. So that is but it's very sad with Heidi. And when she dies, she has all of these images, and she imagines what a shipwrecked sailor would imagine. So she has all these dreams where she is the shipwrecked sailor. And of course, she is a vessel who is carrying a child and who is wrecked. So there's this conflation of lover and beloved, of victim and rescuer in her imagination. This also happens in the Odyssey, where you have a conflation of similes, where the sort of idea of empathy comes out of confusing the similes. So when Penelope and Odysseus finally do get together, and again, he's again a shipwrecked sailor, she's a princess, this has to go well, certain things have to happen. It's important that they're married. It's important that he's not disguised as something else or a god, pretending to be Odysseus. When he finally passes all of her tests and they can be together, her relief is compared to that of a shipwrecked sailor, which I'm going to give you Chapman's version. Chapman of Keats Chapman's Homer fame, which long their hearts have wished, their ship quite lost by Neptune's rigor, and they vexed and tossed twixt winds and black waves, swimming for their lives. A few escaped, and that few that survives, all drenched in foam and brine, crawl up to land with joy as much as they did world's command, so dear to this wife was her husband's sight. So there's this strange thing where she is compared to the shipwrecked sailor who is in sight of land. This is all bringing me, and I'll try not to go too far over, to the Tempest. So the Tempest begins with a storm, and there are several Shakespeare plays that use shipwreck as a plot device, but they don't show the storm. It's always described as something that's happened either before the play or off stage. It's quite dramatic, though, that he has this very realistic storm, shocking storm on stage. And again, it's called the Tempest. It's not called the Enchanted Island, so people may not have known what they were going to experience. I compare it to the sort of beginning of the series Lost, where you have a very realistic plane crash and then end up on a strange enchanted island of mysterious geographical. Master, bosun, here, master, what's cheer? Good, speak to the mariners, fall to it, yarely, or we run ourselves aground, bestir, bestir. I pray now, keep below. Antonia, where is the master, bosun? Do you not hear him? You mar our labor, keep your cabins, you do assist the storm. Nay, good, be patient. When the sea is, hence, what cares these roars for the name of king? To cabin, silence, trouble us not. And when told to remember who is aboard, the bosun declares with exasperation, none that I love more than myself. So Gonzalo, in the time-honored mode of the storm toss, casts his imagination to shore, wishing himself on land. Now would I give 1,000 furlongs of sea for an acre of dry ground, if only to die a dry death. There's an interesting moment. It's almost a split screen. This Tempest starts with this very realistic storm, and then we see something that's happening at the same time on shore, imagining what's happening at sea and what's happening at shore. And Shakespeare gives simultaneous events. He can't show it simultaneously, but we then see Miranda and Prospero watching for the shore. She does something very strange here. If by your art, my dearest father, you have put the wild waters in this roar, allay them, the sky would seem to pour down stinking pitch, but that the sea, mounting to the welkin's cheek, dashes the fire out. And then she says, oh, I have suffered with those that I saw suffer, a brave vessel who had, no doubt, some noble creature in her dashed all to pieces. I think she feels something new here, empathy. She is not supposed to feel this looking at a storm at sea. You're supposed to have some pleasure in this. And she doesn't. She identifies, and again, she's a woman on the verge of marriage, and she's nearly escaped a rape. The father has to marry her off. There are only 2 men on the island. One of them is her father. That's not appropriate. And Caliban, who seems to be some kind of monstrous creature, although our hearts go out to him. So there's a strange thing that happens here. She imagines herself as the people on board, and she is also the vessel. And again, we think of that idea of pregnancy and bearing something inside. But the play that this really kind of comes from is maybe not a successful play, or it has less poetry in it. Actually, it's maybe more successful as a play because things happen. Is Pericles. And there we have Marina, the daughter. In that play, the threat of incest hovers over the entire play, and I think we see that also in The Tempest. It's very important that a man that she can marry come to the island. And Marina, which is also Miranda, she is born in a tempest on a ship. She is a girl who comes, she's not from any shore. When her father finally meets her, they're cast asunder and so forth, and he doesn't recognize her. He's like, where are you from? What shore are you from? And she can't answer that because she's not from shore. She's from the sea. I am a maid, my lord, that never before invited eyes, but have been gazed on like a comet, she speaks, my lord, that may be hath endured a grief, might equal yours if both were justly weighed. She is again the princess on the island, and he is a shipwrecked sailor, but because he's her father, this cannot go badly. And you'll see that the Tempest takes great pains to erase the tension that's built into Pericles. We know there's going to be, we find out it's all geared toward this happy ending. When Marina is asked, what country woman here of these shores? Where I am but a stranger, Marina asked from the deck, you may discern the place. The recognition moment was greatly admired by T.S. Eliot, whose poem Marina is from the point of view of the father. The poem opens with an epigraph in Latin from Seneca's Hercules, quis hic locus, quae regio, quae mundi plaga. What place is this? What region? What shores of the world? It is the question of every shipwrecked sailor on arriving in a new land. Where am I? Miranda, who like Marina, is both the island and the ship. She's refugee and refuge. As she sees more human beings coming ashore, exclaims, like an explorer with a wild surmise, "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." There is a very touching moment, and I'm trying to find it in here, where Prospero describes their arriving to the island. Where is that? And he describes how he gets his strength from having his baby daughter with him. I'm not sure if I can find it here. Well, I'm not sure I can find it in this at present. But he describes, how they are in a leaky boat, how they are cast without any real means of making it to shore, and he's holding his baby daughter in the waves. They are themselves refugees who have washed up on this island. The island that Marina ends up on is Lesbos. I think you may have heard that in the news. All of these routes end up being over and over the site of shipwreck, of families being separated, of smugglers and pirates. O a cherubim that wast that did preserve me. Thou didst smile infused with a fortitude from heaven. When I have decked the sea with drops full salt, under my burden groaned, which raised in me an undergoing stomach to bear up against what should ensue. He describes their casting off itself. In few, they hurried us aboard a bark, bore us some leagues to sea, where they prepared a rotten carcass of a butt, not rigged, nor tackle, sail, nor mast. This is basically a raft, a dinghy. The very rats instinctively have quit it. There they hoist a cry to the winds that roared to us, to sigh to the winds, whose pity sighing back did us but loving wrong. So they are themselves castaways. This has been replayed again and again in what is happening in Greece and has been happening particularly in 2015 and 2016. When refugees arrive on Lesbos, the first thing they ask is, where am I? What land is this? Because they're not sure that they have made a foreign shore. They need to see the Greek flag. The harrowing journey, I think John worked out that in 18 months in 2015 and 2016, 6,300 people at least drowned in the Mediterranean, making these dangerous crossings, many of them women and children. Stephanos Gritsalis, who was the rector of the University of the Aegean, based in Mytilene, distressed at the drownings, invoked a line from Aeschylus's Agamemnon, hoping that we would cease to see the Aegean blossoming with bodies. As with literary shipwrecks, families from Tyre, from Carthage, from Antioch, from Tarsus, from Troy, from Homs and Mosul, Damascus and Kabul are divided. They end up in Ephesus and Mytilene, on Chios and Lampedusa. People drown and are transformed into something not human by the sea, or make land and do not know where they are. Families, as in Comedy of Errors, wash up on different shores, separated in the chaos. Some children might be taken by a Turkish Coast Guard boat while the smugglers speed towards Greece. People lose their papers, their clothes, their passports. There's a wonderful thing about passport in Pericles. Their identities. This is one of many first-hand accounts of refugees arriving on the Aegean Islands. I'm going to close with this, and then I have a very short audio visual. We traveled on the sea. I saw the boat was a dinghy. It only seated 40 people, but there were 54 of us. The smugglers had lied, but they only wanted to get your money. They don't care if you die. We traveled on the sea for an hour. It was so slow. We then came across another boat. We didn't realize it was the police. We were told by friends not to stop because they will take you back to Turkey. We don't know the Greek language. We can't understand what they are saying. They were saying, stop the boat. We held the children and shouted at the police, we have children. I thought to myself, let me reach the beach and anything you say I will do. Again, that prayer in the midst of shipwreck. The boat was punctured and we fell in the water. I was in the sea for 45 minutes before they pulled me out. If I live 200 years, I will never forget it. I'm put in mind of Virgil's description at the end of Book 2 of the Aeneid as the Trojan refugees leave their destroyed city. In the words of Aeneas, I was surprised by the great number of new arrivals I found, women and men, youth gathered for exile, a wretched band of refugees who had poured in from all over, prepared to journey across the sea to wherever lands I might lead them. The brilliant morning star was rising over Ida's ridges, ushering in the day. The Greeks held all the city gates. There was no hope of help. I yielded, and lifting up my father, sought in the mountains. So I have a few, I'm going to show you some slides, and then I'm going to show you, all of the pictures here are drawn by children who have made this crossing. Many of them have been involved in Shipwreck. I personally have interacted with these children. This is their response to how did you come to Greece? They would draw. How did you get to Greece? What were you fleeing? I don't know how to play this. Okay. Maybe it will just play by itself. That plane says Assad on it in Arabic. This child drew the destruction of the teacher. You can see lost an arm. The school was destroyed. Again, exact body parts that are blown apart. John took this picture, arrivals at Lesbos. You can see the heaps of life jackets. Not everyone makes it. These are people coming into Athens from the islands. I was giving out baby carriers. They were in the water. This is a Turkish Coast Guard boat firing on the dinghy with water cannons to sink it. Again, people in life jackets under the night sky. People saying, yes, thank God for their arrival. I think that's a church in the background indicating we've arrived in Greece. This last image, I sort of hesitated about whether to include that, is of a boat that set out this morning from Turkey and capsized. 9 people were rescued, 7 people drowned, 2 women, 5 children. I'm going to show you some raw footage of an arrival, so end on a kind of happy note, that John took from Lesbos. I think sometimes when we see the news and we see the commentary and the production values, you don't get the sort of raw element of what it is like coming on these very flimsy, unseaworthy vessels and the joy of making land and all that involves.
Hey, live for life. Yes. Hey, you. Okay.